for them.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day. We're coming on the air with breaking news. There is a verdict in the civil trial against Donald Trump. It was filed by writer E. Jean Carroll. She accused the former president of raping her in a department store dressing room back in the 90s. I've got the verdict sheet just in front of me right now. I'll walk you through. There were ultimately 10 questions resting on the question of whether she had been raped by Mr. Trump, also questions of whether he had defamed her. On the battery charge, and that gets to, again, the accusation of rape. Question 1, did Mr. Trump rape Miss Carroll? The jury voted no. On the question of did Mr. Trump sexually abuse Ms. Carroll? Yes, the jury said. Moving down to question 4, Ms. Carroll was injured as a result of Mr. Trump's conduct. The jury said yes, and if yes, inserting an amount of $2 million, a monetary judgment against the former president. Keep in mind, E. Jean Carroll's attorneys did not ask for a specific amount of money. They left it to the jury. Moving on to the question, Mr. Trump's conduct was willfully or wantonly negligent, reckless, or done with a conscious disregard of the rights. Yes, the jury said. And moving down to the defamation question, there were ultimately 5 questions related to that accusation. Did Ms. Carroll prove by preponderance of the evidence that Mr. Trump's statement was defamatory? The jury said yes, it was. Did Ms. Carroll prove by clear and convincing evidence that Mr. Trump's statement was false? The jury said yes. Mr. Trump made the statements with actual malice. The jury, yes. And then we're still waiting on some of these other questions, but again, the big headline there, the jury finding that Mr. Trump did sexually abuse Ms. Carroll. Let's go to Laura Jarrett right now. Our legal analyst is standing by. Laura, what do you make of, first of all, that this jury came back in under 4 hours, I think nearly 3 hours, and what we've heard right now in terms of a verdict? Yeah, so fast. Clearly a resounding victory for E. Jean Carroll, who had accused the former president of sexually assaulting her in that dressing room some 20 years ago. The amount here, Lester, is staggering in some ways, given that the jury was not offered a specific amount to award her. All of these numbers that you were just reading out for our audience are numbers that the jury, these 9 jurors, have come up with themselves. They had made a specific strategic move not to ask for a specific dollar amount, and the jury has come up with these numbers in the millions now, including punitive damages, which really speaks to how these jurors viewed the evidence. And just to remind everybody, this was a 9-day trial, relatively short given the stakes against the former president. He has denied all of the allegations vehemently. He said he didn't even know who she was, much less attack her, but she testified over the course of 2 days. The jurors also heard from 2 other women who had accused the former president, claims he also denied, but it was used as evidence to show his playbook when it comes to women. The jury also heard from 2 friends who Carroll said that she told at the time, contemporaneously, about the assault. That perhaps may have bolstered these claims, even though they were so long ago. Perhaps the jury found her more credible, given the 2 other women that testified. And then, of course, Lester, the former president never showed up in person. He was tweeting about his travels overseas to Scotland, but he never showed up, and that is something that was hammered in closing arguments by Carroll's attorney yesterday, Lester. Laura, help me with this question. On the first question, Mr. Trump raped Ms. Carroll. The jury said no, but they came back and said yes on whether he sexually abused Ms. Carroll. From a legal standpoint, where's the daylight? The issue is really one of force. The law obviously breaks down the claim of battery, which was her core claim about what she says happened in that dressing room, and the judge walked them through the legal standards and it basically allowed them some wiggle room. If they didn't find forcible rape, they could use 2 alternatives, one being forcible touching or being sexual abuse. And sexual abuse is what they found that he actually did do, which includes everything from a pinch to rubbing, touching, anything like that can constitute sexual abuse in this conduct. And that's what the judge instructed the jury here today, Lester. All right, Laura, I'll ask you to stand by. Let me bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Danny, explain what this verdict means and the split nature of it on these questions.
The plaintiff here had really two claims. One was for defamation and the other was for the actual sexual assault. And the reason that happened was that originally the statute of limitations had long expired, so the plaintiff here filed a claim for defamation, essentially saying that when Trump called her a liar about her allegations of abuse, that Trump had defamed her. And of course the jury agreed. Then when New York passed a statutory one-year window for all previously expired claims of sexual abuse, civil claims, to be refiled, within half an hour of that statute going into effect, Carroll's legal team filed this civil rape case against Donald Trump. And of course, while the jury did not find that Trump raped E. Jean Carroll, they did find that he sexually abused her, which is really subjecting her to the sexual contact without her consent. So, I mean, this is a very, very clear message that, and I have to say, Lester, I have some of these cases that are under these one-year window, and the challenge is always finding evidence from something that happened decades ago. And what Carroll's verdict tells us is that these cases can be prosecuted, notwithstanding the difficulty in tracking down evidence for an alleged assault that happened in an era that was essentially pre-internet, pre-email, pre-text messaging, and pre the proliferation of video cameras everywhere we go.
Many would argue that Access Hollywood tape, the deposition tape, did serve as sort of a testimony, as sort of a piece of evidence. We may know later on, but right now looking at it, how important, impactful was that potentially to this case?
I'll go a step further, Lester. Without those pieces of evidence, this was an even-odds situation. It could have gone either way. But the Access Hollywood tape, and not just the tape, Lester, but Trump in his deposition, apparently, by my knowledge, for the first time, doubling down on the Access Hollywood tape. You remember in 2016, Trump called that locker room talk. He tried to explain it away. But in this deposition, he appears to support, to double down, to basically stand by his position earlier, saying something really, frankly, bizarre, that, look, celebrities have been able to do this for 1,000,000 years, and fortunately or unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And Laura Jarrett correctly pointed out, in what world is that ever fortunate? These were unforced errors. Trump didn't have to say things like the plaintiff wasn't his type. And you better believe that he handed the plaintiff gold when he said that in his deposition. Look no further than the plaintiff's closing argument. They used all of that evidence, and it was compelling. And I would argue that without that evidence, without Trump shooting himself in the proverbial foot, this would have been a much closer call. I think what Trump did in his deposition did nothing but inflame this jury and give them a really good reason to vote in favor of the plaintiff in this case.
All right, Danny, I'll ask you to hang in there for us while I turn to NBC's Garrett Haake. He's been covering the former president. Garrett, what are you hearing from his inner circle about this verdict?
Well, Lester, no reaction to the verdict itself today, but I can tell you the Trump operation and talking about this case, they've been strategizing for this moment. The former president himself even posted on his social media platform this morning, calling this the false accusation case. And in that Truth Social post, he also conflates this case with one of the other cases in New York where his ability to talk about some of the evidence is circumscribed a little bit. I'm not entirely sure that that's an accident here, confusing these cases. And I say that because his campaign's attitude towards these cases has been to lump them all together and describe all of the various investigations against him, be it the New York City case on falsifying business records that we spent much of last month talking about, this case here, or the case in Georgia, or the two cases going on in the federal court system in D.C. They've lumped all these together as what they describe as a political witch hunt, an effort to get Trump to interfere with the election and to somehow keep him off the ballot by bogging him down in legal challenges. Now, the difference in this case, unlike all the other ones that I've described, there is no Democratic prosecutor, there is no democratically appointed special counsel conducting this investigation. This was purely an investigation of Donald Trump. And the use of that 2016 Access Hollywood tape, I think, could ultimately be very important in the political ramifications of this. Remember back in 2016, in the fall, when that tape came out, just how damaging it was. Here you have a jury finding Donald Trump liable of exactly the same kind of conduct he is on that tape describing. In 2016, the Republican Party largely turned their back on the then candidate Trump until, of course, he won. Does the rest of the Republican Party react in the same way now when Donald Trump has demonstrated such a powerful grip over the base of that party? Time will tell, Lester.
All right, Garrett, thanks. NBC legal analyst Kristen Gibbons-Fedden has been monitoring this trial as well. She's a former prosecutor known for securing a guilty verdict against Bill Cosby during his sexual assault trial. Kristen, how significant is this, especially when we look on the questions in which the jury said no, that he wasn't liable? Is there any room for him to claim any sense of victory or exoneration in any of these questions?
I would say no, not at all. And that's because at the end of the day, they may have said no to the forcible compulsion, but they did say that there was inappropriate and indecent touching. Sexual contact was made with Jeannie Carroll. And that's what survivors want at the end of the day. They want to feel comfortable coming forward and reporting their experiences and getting justice in some way. And in this case, she was rendered an award for that indecent touching that Trump forced upon her. There's also important potential aspects of increased awareness and dialogue about this. It contributes to societal change and better understanding of these type of issues that are faced by survivors. In this case, you may recall, although she promptly told her friends, there was no report to law enforcement. And in fact, that is the norm, not really the exception. And I think that type of experience also strengthens the Me Too movement because it validates the experiences of countless survivors who may not have gone to the police right away, who may not have told someone right away. And I think most importantly, it promotes accountability because at the end of the day, yes, Trump is not going to jail, but he is being held accountable financially. And that's very important for a survivor.
So in other words, the jury is saying, yes, we believe you. We think this actually happened.
I think so, Lester. I think what they're saying is that the plaintiff may not have put on enough evidence to show that they were not, more likely than not, that it was by force. But what they are saying is that there was sexual abuse that occurred. And in that sexual abuse, there is a recognition that there was indecent touching that was not within Jeannie Carroll's consent.
Kristen, we talked a moment ago that the former president didn't appear, he didn't testify at the trial, but there were the deposition recordings. There also the Access Hollywood case that certainly painted him in a negative light. Let me play one of them and get your thoughts on how critical it might have been. This is where he mixes up a photo of Jeannie Carroll.
I don't even know who the woman. Let's see. I don't know who. It's Marla.
You say Marla's in this photo?
That's Marla, yeah. That's my wife.
Which woman are you pointing to? No,
Here.
Carroll.
Oh, is that?
The person you just pointed to was Jeannie Carroll.
Who is that? Who is this?
Point, your wife. And the woman on the right is your then wife,
I don't
Ivana?
know. This was the picture. I assume that's John Johnson. Is that?
That's Carroll.
Because it's very blurry.
And this was used by the plaintiff to point out that this idea that she wasn't his type, in fact, she was his type because he mistook her for his own wife. How critical in a case that stretched on for so many years to affirm the idea that this did happen?
It is extremely critical because, as you pointed out, Lester, it emphasizes that Carroll was exactly Trump's type. And that was utilized by Ms. Carroll's attorney in her closing argument. But she was also able to show, and I think this is important because that goes alongside the remainder of the deposition that also showed the the Access Hollywood tape, because that's really important because rape and sexual abuse is not about sexual gratification, but rather about power and control. So she was able to say, look, Miss Carroll was exactly Trump's type, but this wasn't about what he liked or what he was attracted to. This was about power, access, and control. And she was able to utilize the Access Hollywood type, notwithstanding the combative demeanor that he displayed within those depositions, to actually show Trump's modus operandi, which was to take what he wasn't giving consent to have.
All right, Kristen, thank you very much. Let me turn to NBC legal analyst Carol Lamb. Carol, what's the likelihood of an appeal? And if you were on either side of this case, where would you see room for an appeal?
Well, I think that there is going to be an appeal because Donald Trump likes to play out the legal system as far as he can take it, and he will appeal this. But this is the thing, sir. It's the jury. The jury split this verdict, right? Say they didn't find a rape, which is not a huge surprise because there's no forensic evidence. This case is well over 20 years old. I mean, the allegations are over 20 years old. But for an appeals court to look at this, they're probably going to look at it with a bit of deference towards the jury, because they're going to say this jury, even though it was a quick verdict, they were surgical in their approach. They didn't find him liable on all counts. They rejected the rape count, and that may have been a compromise among the jurors. There may have been some who thought that the rape count should stand, but look, even the witnesses who were introduced for the purpose of showing that he has this MO of assaulting women sexually, they were not raped, right? So the jurors may have said, all right, we'll go with the sexual assault, but we won't go with the rape. So I think an appeals court is, barring some sort of outrageous conduct, which we have not seen evidence of in this court, the appeals court is unlikely, I think, to reverse this judgment.
And as we know, this was a civil case. The bar was lower for to find him liable of this. Yet there will be folks who will look at this and wonder, will there be any form of criminal accountability for these actions?
And that's unlikely because of the age of these events. But let's put this into perspective. This is a former president of the United States being held accountable for some pretty horrendous conduct that took place even a long time ago.
Laura Jarrett, let me bring you back into the conversation. You've had a time to kind of go over these various questions. I think there were 10 questions in all that the jury was asked to answer on these issues of battery, which in this case would be the sexual assault allegation, and the defamation. What stands out to you as you go through this?
Yeah, Lister, again, the fact that they awarded punitive damages, I think, is noteworthy because, as it's sort of self-explanatory, it's meant to punish. It's meant for conduct that is seen as extremely reckless and seen as highly immoral, as described by the judge today, and clearly something that this jury used to send a message. And it's interesting, you know, this jury was kept anonymous, and so we don't know all that much about them, but you can imagine in the coming days, there's going to be a lot of desire to try to get in their heads, to try to get inside that jury room to understand their deliberations more and what was persuasive to them and what wasn't. And it's the little bit that we do know about them is interesting. You know, they're all walks of life. You have a former janitor, you have a physical therapist, several parents. They range in age from 26 into their late 60s. They come from all over the state of New York because it's a federal case. And I should note the reason that they're anonymous is because the judge, in a rare move, decided to keep this jury secret because he said the risk to them was that the former president would tweet about them or post about them on social media and that they could be subject to attack. The judge saying that the president has a history of coming after jurors, other folks in law enforcement, members of the judiciary themselves. And so it's just interesting to note that he did such a rare move here, but the jury's verdict is obviously self-explanatory now.
I'm curious what the legal thinking was to not ask for a damage amount in this case, to leave it to the jury at the same time that the plaintiffs are claiming her reputation was hurt, presumably her marketability was hurt. What was the thinking there, you believe?
I think that it was a strategic move because they knew if they put a certain dollar amount on it, then if they fell short of that, that would be seen as a devastating loss, whereas now you have $5 million that has been awarded when she didn't ask for a single dime. She didn't ask for anything. And so I think from an optics, from a strategic standpoint, it was a deliberate move by Carroll's attorneys.
And back to the idea of whether there will be an appeal. Does that again make it harder for the defendant in this case to have an appeal when the number is not what most people would think outrageous in terms of the size?
I think the harder thing for the former president is that it's a jury trial. And typically when you have a jury trial and you have several days of testimony and the judge has allowed him a last-ditch opportunity to testify, which he didn't take, those are the kinds of things I think the court will find interesting. Obviously, the number itself, again, eye-popping.
Laura Jarrett, thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. More throughout the day on our streaming channel, NBC News Now. And, of course, on Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt in New York. Good day, everyone.